This morning's scripture reading is from the book of Job, chapter 12, verses 7 through 12, and the author writes, "But ask the animals, and they will teach you, or the birds in the sky, and they will tell you, or speak to the earth, and it will teach you, or let the fish in the sea inform you. Which of these does not know that the hand of our God has done this? In God's hand is the life of every creature and the breath of all humankind. Does not the ear test words as the tongue tastes food? Is not wisdom found among the aged? Does not long life bring understanding?" Here ends today's reading. Thanks be to God for these words of life.
Today we continue our Voices series. The book of Proverbs states, "Turn your ear to wisdom and incline your heart to understanding." Today we are listening to understand. Union Church is listening to voices from faith traditions we don't typically encounter on Sunday mornings. During this 7-week series, we have already explored perspectives from the Jewish, Islamic, and womanist traditions. You can see those on our YouTube channel. Check them out. They were really fantastic presentations. And today we hear about God and our beloved animals. Next week we will hear a Native American perspective, and then artificial intelligence communities, that'll be weird, and then differently abled. I'm falling in love with AI. I'm a little suspicious of my passion at this moment. This listening series is based on one of the last prayers of Jesus as described in John 17. The overheard prayer of Jesus asks that all the world may be one. This prayer is a motto of our beloved United Church of Christ. John 17:21 says that all may be one. Jesus' prayer acknowledges the divisions of the world that cause pain and death. Jesus prays with the divine for true reconciliation so that all the world may unify into a holistic divinity, that all may be one. Today we seek to listen so that we may gain wisdom and that our hearts may be reconciled to the whole of God's divinity. Reverend Glowiak will now introduce Dr. Stone.
My first introduction to Dr. Ken Stone was actually not at Chicago Theological Seminary. In undergrad, I took a course called Queer Theory in Biblical Worlds because, of course, Grinnell College would offer a course like that. And one of the assigned readings was Practicing Safer Texts, Food, Sex, and Bible in Queer Perspective by Ken Stone. And so when I did begin at CTS in my first semester and I had Professor Stone in Hebrew Bible 1, I was actually a little starstruck. It was the first time I had read a book and then met the author afterwards. And so I was really, really excited about it. And you'd think Hebrew Bible 1, Old Testament 101 essentially, I think it would be a pretty straightforward class. But I remember on the first day of class, Professor Stone said, we're going to read stories that you think you know, but there's a lot in there that you've been taught that just isn't in there. And there's a lot in there that you haven't been taught and you haven't seen yet. A lot of these, Hebrew Bible 101, a lot of this stuff is like Sunday school type stories. And you think you know because you've been taught, or the prevailing sort of culture and narrative teaches you, this is what this means, right? The serpent is the devil. Oh, wait, actually the serpent, that's not actually in the Bible. The fruit of the tree is an apple. Like that, it's not an apple, it's just a fruit. There's all sorts of sort of little things that you take for granted. And so I really appreciated Ken's approach to that course in terms of trying to read stories for the first time to kind of really see what's in there and take a new perspective on that. And so I'm looking forward to sharing this opportunity with you to hear Ken's perspective on animals.
Good morning. Some of you will have heard back in October that Jane Goodall passed away. Goodall inspired a lot of people, including myself. I was pleased to see her speak in Chicago not that long ago. In fact, Goodall spent a lot of her time during the last few decades of her life traveling around the world to raise awareness not only about the plight of the chimpanzees that she had studied, who are now endangered, but also environmental problems more broadly. It was her view that if we're going to address those problems, we have to be aware of what they are and how serious they are. And she argued that realistic solutions to environmental problems require a partnership with those most directly affected by them. Goodall understood that environmental challenges and social and political challenges are intertwined. But the credibility with which Goodall addressed such issues in the later years of her life was grounded in a reputation that she built much earlier in her life. As is well known, Goodall spent years in Tanzania studying chimpanzees in the wild. She followed them closely, day after day, gradually acclimating them to her presence and carefully recording details of their lives. Some of her methods were unconventional at the time, though they have since become more common. She treated the chimpanzees not only as members of another species, but also as individuals with diverse personalities and a range of emotions. She uncovered multiple parenting styles, observed intense forms of grief over the deaths of closely related individuals, and documented a kind of deadly warfare between rival chimpanzee communities. She wrote in a striking way about the bodily responses that some chimpanzees have to such phenomena as waterfalls and thunderstorms, responses that she interpreted as a kind of primate spirituality. And perhaps most famously, she revealed for the first time that chimpanzees both make and use tools, something that had previously been considered unique to human beings. She reoriented our understanding of chimpanzees and other animals, but she also helped to reorient our understanding of ourselves as primates among other primates. Together with other researchers, Goodall demonstrated that we aren't as different from our animal kin as we once assumed. Now, there are a lot of ways to describe Goodall's work with the chimpanzees. But as a biblical scholar who's written a book about animals in the Bible, I like to think of Jane Goodall as a modern practitioner of some of the words we've chosen to highlight today from Job 12. Ask the animals, and they will teach you. The birds of the air, and they will tell you. Or the plants of the earth, and they will teach you. And the fish of the sea, and they will declare to you. Of course, Goodall didn't try to justify what she was doing by quoting the Bible, though she was a very spiritual person whose grandfather had been a congregational minister. But I want to suggest that Goodall's attempt to understand and act on behalf of all of God's creatures, human and animal alike, is consistent with an important strand of biblical tradition, a strand that we find in the book of Job, but that we also find in other parts of the Bible. Now, this is not the way that most of us were taught to think about the Bible. Many of us were raised, as I was, with a fairly simple story about the Bible's approach to animals and nature. According to this simple story, we humans were given dominion or rule over the rest of creation. The Israelites, like other ancient peoples, exercised their dominion over animals through such things as animal sacrifice. We moderns are more enlightened than that, or so we like to tell ourselves, but we also exercise dominion over animals in other supposedly more humane ways. That's the simple story. And we should note that this simple story about the Bible has sometimes been used to justify pretty much anything we decide to do to other animals, as long as we perceive a benefit for humans. And it's true that we find parts of this simple story in the Bible, including in Genesis 1, which just happens to be one part of the Bible that most people of faith know. Whenever people decide, I'm going to read the Old Testament this year, they get at least that far before they run into a genealogy or something and put the Bible aside. But if they kept reading, or even if they just read Genesis 1 more carefully, they might be surprised to discover that matters are a lot more complicated than the simple story of human dominion over animals implies. After all, God creates all the animals in Genesis 1 and declares them all to be good and even very good, like us. God declares that animals will increase and multiply, something God also says about humans. God gives them distinct habitats in which to live. God gives us all food, and more specifically, in Genesis 1, a vegetarian diet for humans too. The animals are described in Genesis 1 as having living nephesh, which is the same Hebrew word that is sometimes translated as soul when it is applied to humans. Animals arguably have soul in the Hebrew Bible. Animals and humans are also both created out of the same dirt in Genesis 2. So not only do we share soul with animals, we also are formed out of the same physical substance. That's all just in the first 2 chapters of Genesis. Elsewhere, in Psalm 104 and the book of Ecclesiastes, both humans and animals are also said to have spirit, which we all receive from God and which allows us to live as we breathe God's Spirit. Psalm 36:6 praises God by saying, "You save human and animal alike, O Lord." That multi-species salvation is acted out in multiple stories in the Bible, including the story of the flood and Noah's Ark, which one environmental philosopher calls the first endangered species project. So too in the Exodus story, the Israelite animals are explicitly saved or delivered with the Israelite humans. After the Exodus, Israel's domesticated animals, like the Israelites, are supposed to rest on the Sabbath. And when the prophet Isaiah looks forward to a hoped-for future of peace, animals participate in that future alongside humans. There are other passages I could refer to here, but that quick litany of examples suffices to make a point. Across the whole of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, animals play a much larger role in the story of God's relationship to humans and the earth than we have usually recognized. Theologians and biblical scholars haven't always done a very good job of acknowledging this, at least until recent years. But when we begin to explore the Bible by intentionally looking for animals and animal images, much as Jane Goodall went in search of the chimpanzees, we may be surprised how often we discover them and what we learn about them. And this really shouldn't shock us. The Israelites, like most people in the ancient world, lived closer to animals than many of us do. It's not accidental that when they went looking for a metaphor to describe their relationship to God, they ended up declaring that the Lord is my shepherd. For they could see flocks of sheep and goats all around them and knew about the care and protection that such animals required. This was true even in ancient cities. One of the most common types of archaeological remains found at excavated cities from ancient Israel consists of animal bones, and especially bones of sheep, goats, and cattle. Many Israelite houses were constructed in such a way that animals actually lived in the same dwelling with humans. Wild animals were probably seen less often, but still they were there. When the writer of 2 Kings describes bears emerging from the brush and attacking some youths, or when the psalmist writes about lions roaring in the night, seeking their food from God. This is because the writers of the Bible knew that lions and bears were living around them. They knew that bears did sometimes attack people. They heard lions roaring in the night, and they attempted to integrate those animals into their understanding of the God who created us all. While this is true for many parts of the Bible, it's especially true for the book of Job. We may not recognize this immediately because the book of Job is not the easiest book to read. If you ever started reading it and you got lost after the first 2 or 3 chapters, you're not alone. The book takes the form of an extended argument with many different points of view expressed. And the argument in Job is focused on serious matters, such as the reality of undeserved suffering and the responsibility that God may have for it. In another context, on another day, we might discuss those matters in a great deal of detail. But what I want to underscore today is just how often the speakers in this argument in the book of Job refer to animals and animal images. Like some other ancient texts that we associate with the biblical wisdom tradition, including Proverbs, the book of Job seems to assume that we can look around the world and at all of its creatures and discern something important about the nature of God. We need to ask the animals. In fact, when God finally enters the argument late in the book of Job, God delivers a lengthy speech that focuses almost entirely on animals, describing a range of beautiful creatures with whom God interacts. The references to animals in the book of Job are so striking that a theologian named Elizabeth Johnson chose a title for one of her books from the passage we read today, Ask the Animals. Johnson's book is not focused only on the book of Job, but she argues that Christian theology needs to place more emphasis on animals, on our relations with animals, and on God's relations with animals. And the book of Job is one of the biblical texts that she uses to ground her argument. Now, with as many problems as we currently have in our world, thinking about animals can sometimes feel trivial. In a world where small children are detained and shipped out of state by our government, the practice of responding to Job's admonition to ask the animals may not seem like a high priority. But environmental problems are actually among the primary causes of migration on a global scale. And a strong case can be made that neither our social and political problems nor our environmental problems can be addressed adequately unless we begin to think about all of them together, exactly as Goodall suggested. Indeed, the Bible suggests this as well, because when some of the prophets, including Jeremiah, Hosea, and Joel, talk about wickedness and injustice in the human realm, one of the things they point out, though it's seldom noted, is that wickedness leads to environmental destruction and the disappearance of animals and birds. I would argue that this is also the situation in which we find ourselves today, when the most horrific social and political violence is accompanied by environmental destruction that affects humans and animals alike. Now, in this situation, we obviously can't all be Jane Goodall, but each of us can attempt, in our own way, to ask the animals, as it were, to study their ways, to let them teach us about the world that we inhabit together and the threats that we are putting in the way of our collective flourishing. For most of us, this probably won't mean following chimpanzees in the wild, but it might mean paying attention to the lives of birds or coyotes and foxes, rabbits and pigeons, bears and beavers, abandoned cats and discarded dogs, of the animals whose bodies make it to our tables, and then finding ways to respond to them as fellow creatures whose lives, like ours, are considered very good by God. Thanks be to God.